Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu attaqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, as we have been discussing, looking at the life lessons of the Prophet ﷺ, and particularly the outcomes of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. If you remember, we talked about this very important, critical corridor of safety that the treaty created, allowing many to consider Islam without fear or pressure from their society. And we found that because of that, some of the leaders of the Quraysh, like Khalid ibn al-Walid, Uthman ibn Talha, Amr ibn al-As, impacted positively by this corridor, were able to embrace the faith and join the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina. There's another powerful example of such a conversion happening during this time between Al-Hudaybiyah and Am al-Fath, and that was from Abdul Kaaba, accepting Islam after the passing of his mother Ruman, the wife of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. That's right, the son of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, who was once an adversary. He was actually an enemy combatant of the Prophet ﷺ, participating in Badr on the side of the idolaters. After much consideration, he joined his family in Medina, and of course was welcomed by the Prophet ﷺ, who changed his name to Abdul Rahman, from being the worshipper of the Kaaba to being the worshipper of Allah ar-Rahman. And it was certainly a moment of celebration, not only for his family, but for the Muslim community alike, as he became one of the most active members of his society. And this continued throughout that period. The Muslim community almost doubled in size. If you remember, when they made their pilgrimage, they were roughly 2,000. And by the time they went to Mecca after the treaty was broken, they numbered 10,000. And so this scenario, or the outcome of this treaty, provided this very, very important time and security for people to begin to consider Islam and join the Muslims in Medina. And as more individuals from Arab society started to consider and embrace the faith, the Prophet ﷺ began to turn his attention beyond Arabia entirely. And this, of course, was no coincidence. It was a clear command from Allah that Islam, as a universal religion, had to be delivered to all of humanity. The Prophet ﷺ emphasized this point himself, and he said that I've been given 5 things that no prophet before me was given. And from those 5 things, he says, وَكَانَ النَّبِيُّ يُبْعَثُ إِلَى قَوْمِهِ خَاصَةً وَبُعِثْتُ إِلَى النَّاسِ عَامَّةً. He said it would be that a prophet before was sent to his people specifically, while I was sent to all of mankind. You can find this in Sahih Bukhari. And this is a critical point for us to understand. Islam was never and is not meant to be confined to a specific group or a specific region. It's a global message. And we, as the followers of that message, have a responsibility to ensure that it reaches every corner of the globe. And it's not an act of charity on our part. It's not an act of goodwill on our part, but it is a duty. It is a moral obligation as Muslims to continue preaching as the Prophet ﷺ commanded. From the very beginning, the Prophet ﷺ understood the universal nature of his mission. Even during the most challenging days in Mecca, he tried his best to inspire his people with a vision for the future. He would say, قُولُوا لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ تُفْلِحُوا. Say there is no God but Allah and you will be successful. قولوا لا إله إلا الله تملك العرب والعجم. He would say to them, there is no God but Allah, and you will gain influence over both the Arab as well as the non-Arabs. The Prophet ﷺ always had this vision that the mission would spread beyond his own society. He didn't act, however, on that vision until after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Until that point, the Prophet ﷺ and the believers lacked political legitimacy to address the leaders of the international community. The Prophet ﷺ, through these actions, taught us the importance of being realistic in our approach. I mean, think about it for a moment. Sending letters to kings and emperors asking them to abandon their religions and adopt a completely new faith, one that they had likely not heard of. And if they had heard of it up to this point, it was associated with persecution and hardship. And we see this realism in earlier moments as well. The Prophet ﷺ, when he sent the Muslims from Mecca to migrate to Abyssinia, their goal was not to invite the Najashi to Islam, but to seek refuge in his kingdom. They sought safety, not converts. And it was only when Amr ibn al-As tried to turn the Najashi against the Muslims that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib explained Islam. It was only as a reaction and a defense mechanism. And he did not invite Najashi to embrace the faith, even though he felt that the Najashi may be sympathetic. The timing simply wasn't right, and the situation required caution. This approach teaches us a powerful lesson about da'wah, that it must be done with wisdom and careful planning. The Prophet ﷺ knew that reaching out to the world's leaders prematurely would likely cause greater harm than good. And it wasn't about fear or hesitation on his part, more than it was about strategy and foresight. The Prophet ﷺ, had it been the right move, he certainly would have done it earlier. There was nothing stopping him at the very beginning of his mission from sending messengers, sending emissaries around the world to convey this invitation. However, the Prophet ﷺ waited until the time was right, teaching us that success comes from understanding the complexities of our environment and acting with foresight. And the rational evidence for this strategy is quite clear. Again, think about launching a global invitation to Islam, asking the world's leaders to change their religions, while the Muslims themselves were vulnerable. It would have likely caused more harm than good. Without the necessary strength and influence, such a move would have appeared to be unrealistic and ineffective. The idea that the world leaders at that time of Rome and Persia and Yemen, they would have abandoned their power and their status for the call of a man from a small village in the deserts of Arabia was seemingly far from practical. Any attempt to invite them to Islam at this point in such an environment would have likely been dismissed or ignored entirely. After the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, however, everything changed for the Prophet ﷺ and his mission. The Quraysh, as the most influential and respected Arab tribe, had global recognition. Of course, they were not on par with the great empires of Persia and Rome. They did, however, hold some clout among world leaders. And the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, though they sought it to secure their economy and to avoid further bloodshed, inadvertently it gave recognition to the Muslim state as a sovereign entity. And this was the turning point which gave Islam legitimacy on an international scale. It was an outcome that they could have never imagined would happen. This type of acknowledgement from the Quraysh was not just a local agreement, but it served as a global signal. By signing the treaty, the Quraysh effectively legitimized the Muslim state, allowing or acknowledging its sovereignty and independence. And this shift in the local politics gave the Prophet ﷺ the credibility and the authority he needed to reach out to other rulers on a similar playing field. And that's when he began to invite them to Islam. And it marked a new phase in his mission of spreading the faith. And now the message could be presented on a global stage with the weight of an established and respected state behind it, meaning the state of Medina. Without this legitimacy, it's highly unlikely that any other state would have engaged in the way that they expected. The Quraysh formally recognizing them in this manner was absolutely essential. Before that, the Muslims were seen as nothing more than an illegitimate faction rebelling against their own people, the dominant and honorable tribe of Quraysh. And so this was an absolute necessity to move forward. And it's precisely why the Prophet ﷺ sought this strategic legitimacy through his enemies' recognition. He was able to utilize what they were willing to do for the betterment of the Muslim community. And this global recognition of Islam as being a legitimate state now, it didn't happen by accident. It wasn't something that just fell in the Prophet's lap, but it was a part of our Prophet's explicit vision for Islam's universal reach. And this was a vision that he shared with his companions very early on in some of the most challenging days. And one very memorable example of this was when they were preparing for the Battle of Al-Ahzab. And the Prophet ﷺ is down there in the ditch with his companions digging. And they come across a large boulder, an immovable object that no one could break. The Prophet ﷺ with his pickaxe struck at that boulder, sparks flying with each strike. And as he struck it, declared to his companions, "By Allah, I have been shown the keys to Persia, Rome, and Yemen," indicating to them the far reach that Islam was meant to have. He said these lands will be opened to Islam. And this was during a time of siege and uncertainty. And the Muslims were on the defense. And with this, the Prophet ﷺ instilled hope in the Muslim community and also gave them a clear sense of purpose and direction. He was not just leading a small community, but he was preparing them for a global mission. And this vision came to life after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Prophet ﷺ began formally reaching out to the world leaders, sending letters inviting them to Islam. And among those, he reached out to the Emperor Heraclius, the ruler of Kisra, of Persia, named Kisra, titled Kisra, the Najashi of Abyssinia, Muqawqis of Egypt, and the leaders of Yemen. In all directions, he sent dispatches and invitations to Islam. The letters were not mere formalities, not like political recognition of our existence, but they were direct invitations to embrace the faith and to achieve success. This was backed by the authority of an emerging state and their undeniable truth when it came to delivering their mission. There's a very profound example of this, the result of these letters that we can find when the Prophet ﷺ dispatched a letter to the leaders of Yemen. This was essentially the first answer to that call. He sent letters to the rulers of Yemen. Among them was a man named Badhan, who was the Persian governor of Sana'a. And initially, after receiving this letter, he was extremely skeptical of the Prophet's claim. Badhan received this letter, and he sent emissaries to the Prophet ﷺ to gauge his legitimacy. And when they got there, they found him responding to them with a prophecy. He told them that the ruler of Persia had been killed. And when they went back to their governor, Badan, before they could confirm that news, word reached them that indeed it had come to pass just as the Prophet ﷺ prophesied. And this established for them the truthfulness of the Prophet's message. It was a turning point. Not only did Badan accept the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ, but he embraced Islam along with his officials and many of the people. And what followed after that was quite remarkable, highlighting to us the Prophet's political acumen. Not only did Badan and his followers convert to Islam, but the Prophet ﷺ recognized them formally as the rightful leaders of Yemen under the new Muslim state. He left them in their positions of power, and this demonstrated his wisdom and diplomatic intelligence. It also ensured a smooth transition of power while maintaining stability in the region, and the leadership of Yemen, now aligned with the Muslim state, would go on to play a crucial role in spreading Islam further into southern Arabia. The interaction here with Yemen and these leaders highlights the Prophet's ability to combine between divine guidance and strategic outreach. It was not just about inviting individuals to Islam, but it was about transforming entire societies and integrating them into the global mission of the faith. And it shows us the importance of reaching out to others with wisdom, foresight, and trust in Allah's plan. Through these efforts, our beloved Prophet ﷺ established a model of international engagement that balanced firmness in faith with flexibility in strategy, ultimately laying the foundation for Islam's global reach and enduring legacy. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضاه ونصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Brothers and sisters, as we reflect on the Prophet's strategic outreach following the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, there are many lessons that emerge that we can learn from today. The Prophet ﷺ, during this time in particular, demonstrated the importance of building legitimacy, understanding the environment that he was working in, and engaging others with wisdom and purpose. His outreach was not reactionary, but it was deliberate, grounded in the principles of Islam, and guided by a vision for the spread of the faith around the globe. The Prophet ﷺ, his approach teaches us that alliances and engagements with others must be rooted in sincerity and mutual benefit. Whether through the acknowledgement of the Quraysh or the conversion of Yemen's leaders, we can see how strategic relationships can pave the way for broader acceptance of truth. It's also important to note that his efforts were always aligned with a deep commitment to the principles of Islam. The Prophet ﷺ would not compromise on the faith or the values that the community upheld. That was never an option. The Prophet ﷺ always put the betterment of the faith and the Muslim community up front. You can also see the Prophet's wisdom in timing. When he began his global outreach, it reminds us of the importance of patience and understanding the moment, understanding what's happening. By waiting until the Muslim community had gained strength and legitimacy, he ensured that his message would be taken seriously and would resonate far beyond Arabian society. And for us today, the lessons, they have clear applications. Locally, we must seek to establish ourselves as contributors to society. Not only as individuals, but as a collective. We have to build trust and relationships with others around us. We cannot isolate ourselves. Like the Prophet ﷺ, we should engage with sincerity, fostering respect and understanding among those that live with us. Strategic partnerships with community leaders, organizations, and even those who may not fully align with us can help pave the way for a greater impact so long as we remain grounded in our faith. At the same time, we have to have the wisdom to recognize when certain pursuits might harm us. Not every alliance is beneficial, and we have to know when to step away, as being just as important as knowing when to engage. The Prophet ﷺ reminds us that true leadership requires the bravery to do that. Even when you forged relationships for decades and alliances that were once beneficial, when they are now harming and undermining us, severing those connections is absolutely essential for the benefit of the long-term vision of our mission. Lastly, the Prophet ﷺ, his outreach to Yemen, highlights the transformative power of da'wah. Shows us just how powerful that can be when it's carried out with insight and trust in Allah. The Prophet ﷺ was able to bring entire societies into the fold of Islam through thoughtful and strategic efforts. So we too have to focus on building similar pathways for others to learn about and connect to Islam and the Muslim community. And this begins at home. This begins at an individual level, at a family level, within our communities, by exemplifying, by illustrating through our own actions the values of our faith, and also by creating spaces that are welcoming for others to join us. And so with that, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the wisdom to follow in the footsteps of our Prophet in this mission, to grant us sincerity in emulating and practicing his sunnah, alayhi salatu wassalam, not only in worship of Allah, but in our dedication to spreading his message. Brothers and sisters, I would be remiss if I didn't mention to you as we begin this new year that the Gaza's Health Ministry has recently confirmed that more than 108,000 Palestinians have been injured in Israel's onslaught since October 7th, 2023. More than 45,500 men, women, and children have been killed, and the true toll is thought to be multiple times higher. In the words of Omar Bartov, who is actually an Israeli-American professor of Holocaust and genocide studies at Brown University, this is a total moral and ethical failure by the very countries that claim to be the main protectors of civil rights, democracy, and human rights around the world. And while we continue to mourn and pray for the loss of those innocent lives, we remain outraged, not only by our nation's complicity in funding, arming, and shielding this foreign nation's genocidal actions, ethnic cleansing, and annexation of the Gaza Strip and beyond, we are also appalled by those in our Cherry Hill and Camden County community, be they the local leaders or everyday citizens who support and cheer on such atrocities. Their actions are without a doubt shameful and will forever be a looming cloud over the history of our region and certain to cast an inescapable darkness on them the day of resurrection. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, "Al-dhulmu dhulumatun yawm al-qiyamah." Oppression will turn into darkness on the day of resurrection. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant relief to those that are suffering and liberation to those that have been oppressed. Allahumma yassir wa la tu'assir wa tammim bil khair wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana